Good evening, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's public event series, Regeneration. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. As the public face of the humanities for the UC Santa Barbara campus, our mission is to mount programs and support research that advances knowledge about human experience in social, historical, and cultural context. Much of our work takes place in the area of the public humanities through programs that empower community members as agents of social change. And you can learn more about the IHC's programs and sign up for our mailing list on the table in the back of the room. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Regeneration Series and the Sarah Miller McCune and George D. McCune Endowment. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will take audience questions. If you have a question, you'll be able to approach the microphones that will be at the front of the two aisles. Finally, before we begin our program tonight, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which UCSB is located, and I would like to pay respect to Chumash elders, past and present, as well as to other Indigenous people present. All year, the Regeneration Series has featured speakers who have been considering the social sensibilities and collective actions needed to create a world of greater stability, equity, and solidarity. The work of tonight's speaker, Dexter Filkins, falls squarely within Regeneration's purview. Much of Filkins' career has been dedicated to reporting on the victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and survivors of war, as well as the politicians, policymakers, and leaders who shape military conflicts and their resolutions. From 2000 to 2010, Filkins was at the New York Times, reporting from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. He was part of a team of New York Times reporters who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for their dispatches from Pakistan and Afghanistan. Filkins joined The New Yorker as a staff writer in 2011. At The New Yorker, he has written about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, the uprisings in Yemen, the crises in Syria and Lebanon, the Prime Minister of Turkey, and a troubled Iraq War veteran who tracked down the surviving members of the family that his unit had opened fire on. Most recently, he has reported on the leader of the Belarusian Democratic Movement, the crisis of Belarus involving asylum seekers from the Middle East, the regrouping of ISIS in Syria, and a Ukrainian refugee who arrived in Brooklyn. Described as the premier combat journalist of his generation, Filkins published The Forever War in 2008. The book won the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction and was named the Best Book of the Year by The Times, The Washington Post, Time, and the Boston Globe. Filkins has also been honored with 2 George Polk Awards and 2 National Magazine Awards for stories that appeared in the New York Times Magazine. I am very happy and honored to welcome Dexter Filkins to UCSB to deliver his talk, Afghanistan, The Forever War Ends. Thank you.
Oh my God, that's very nice. Thank you. Oh, it's like I'm blushing. My mom is blushing. Everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you so much. I just want to say before I start, I was lucky enough to spend the last 24 hours in this lovely city. God, you guys are lucky. It's never going to be like this after you leave. It's such a beautiful place. Don't take it for granted. So we're gonna talk about Afghanistan, and you know, if you're like me, it feels like ancient history already. And the only foreign country I've been thinking of for the last 3 months is Ukraine, which is, you know, epic and extraordinary, and the drama is amazing. So I want to ask you your indulgence and kind of try to bring you back, because I think what happened there, and you probably remember it, you probably saw some of it on television. It was wrenching. It was horrifying, and I think it was kind of a turning point for the country. And so it's worth, I think, we've had enough time. It's worth trying to kind of assess what it means and maybe how we ought to try to remember it. So let's just start with that. I mean, it was. Remember, it was the longest war in American history. It lasted 20 years. 3,500 Americans dead, probably something like 70,000 Afghan dead. So let's just start with the really basic question. I mean, I want to try to talk about how and why we left, but first, just to start, what was the war about? What were we trying to do there? And that's actually pretty simple. The United States got attacked on 9/11, and it was attacked by a terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and that was basically being harbored by, or given sanctuary by the state, which was the Taliban, which was this kind of group of very, very conservative, primitive religious movement, and they had given them sanctuary. So basically, when the World Trade Center was attacked, we went in and destroyed the Afghan state. And basically for 20 years, we tried to build a state to replace the one we destroyed, and to build a state that would basically outlast our presence so we could leave. And that was it. That's basically what the war is about. And we failed, as you all remember from the really terrible scenes of last August when it all kind of fell apart. And so I want to just kind of ask the question, the really big question, kind of why did we fail there? Why and how? And I think, I remember when I was living there, and kind of a place like that, when a country like the United States comes to a deeply foreign country like Afghanistan, it's so complicated and changing all the time. And I would kind of, at the end of a very long day, the best I ever felt was I have this kind of very tenuous understanding of maybe what's happening out there. And the next morning it was all gone, and that's how hard it was. So why did we fail there? And I think it was complicated, but basically, I think we can boil it down to a few kind of very important things. And one was simply the country as we found it, and the country that we inherited, the country that basically, we broke the state and kind of went there and stayed for 20 years. And I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's an extraordinary place. It's utterly, as you can see from some of these photos, it's the most beautiful country on earth. And it's basically mountains and deserts. And if you remember, I wish I had a map here, but it's landlocked. It's in the middle of Central Asia. It's basically surrounded by kind of countries that are hostile to Afghanistan, but also hostile to us. And it's kind of a cursed country in the sense that every year, if there's not a war going on, and the war's been going on there for since 1979, there's a famine, or there's a plague. Good number to remember is 4%, and that's 4% of the land in Afghanistan is arable. That's it. The rest of it is like desert and rocks, and you can see it. And maybe in some of these photos, you look down these mountain valleys, and there's a tiny little stream, and then on each side of the stream, maybe 20 feet of green, of where people are growing stuff. And the rest of it is just rocks, And that's the country. And that's kind of the country that we found. And when we arrived there 20 years ago, it was a long time ago, the country had already been at war for 21 years. It was already destroyed by the time we got there. And so I want to sort of chart really quickly the history, basically before we got there, because it's really important. It's all really relevant today, and it's because it's why, ultimately, one of the reasons we failed, and why it was just so hard. I think the modern story of Afghanistan starts in 1979. The country was invaded by the Soviet Union. The parallels to what's happening in Ukraine right now are kind of extraordinary. The Soviet Union invaded because they wanted a friendly government there. They succeeded in doing that, but they lost the war. They stayed there for 10 years. They were incredibly brutal, killed, at an absolute minimum, killed about 1 million people. Displaced, depending on who was counting, they displaced a quarter of the country, 4 million, 5 million refugees, just totally destroyed the place. So basically from 79 to 89, you had the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union left, and then all the guys that we had armed, the warlords, turned on each other. So you had this terrible civil war that killed tens of thousands of more people. You had, basically more destruction. And then something really important happened that basically is directly relevant to today, which is you had this terrible war going on, and Pakistan, which is just to the south, which was flooded with Afghan refugees, basically said, we've got to do something. We got to end this war. What did they do? They found a group of people who were like the meanest, toughest, baddest fighters and most effective fighters that they could find in the whole country, and it was the Taliban. And they found them, and they got behind them, and they basically pushed them forward. And when they did that, so this is now kind of the middle 1990s, very quickly, within a year and a half, the Taliban are just sweeping across the country, basically. And so they took the capital in 1996, and they were basically in power for 5 years before we got there. Super conservative, really, really poor. The country's destroyed. It's in total ruin. And this is actually, I was lucky enough to actually see the place under the Taliban before 9/11. And I was a correspondent in India, and the Taliban were, they were very strange. They didn't really have relations with the outside world. They only had 3 embassies in the entire, over the whole globe, and they didn't let reporters in. And then one day they decided, somebody somewhere decided, let's let some correspondents in. And so I was one of the correspondents that got to go in. And I'll never forget, got the visa, went to the Khyber Pass, and there was like 8 of us, and we went in a kind of a convoy. As soon as we crossed the border, total destruction. And all the roads are gone. And so I remember watching the cars in front of me. They were just dipped down into these craters and then up and then down and then up. And all on the roads, along the roads on the way into Kabul. It's only 100 miles. It took us like 16 hours. There were just the overturned Soviet tanks, old Soviet uniforms lying around, just wreckage everywhere. And we got to the capital, and Kabul's such an amazing city. It's at 7,000 feet. It's ringed by mountains. It's utterly stunning. I mean, it's stunning even in ruins. I mean, I remember the first time I went there, I felt like I'm in the middle of like the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's really, really a beautiful place. Total ruin. And I remember the first thing I saw when we got there were so many of the parents, so many of the men were dead, so many of the women. There were these huge packs of orphans that were just roaming the city, 50, 100, and they were kind of running together. And I remember they ran towards us. They saw us, and they started screaming, and they were in their tattered clothes and their dirty faces, and they kind of ran towards us. And then out of nowhere, these Taliban guys would come out with these whips and like beat them with whips. And it was like a science fiction movie. It was so strange. And that very day that I got there, that I arrived, it was a Thursday. Friday is the important day in Islam. It's when they have Friday prayers. And so I was staying in the Intercontinental Hotel, which is a big hotel in the center of the city. It had been hit by a missile a couple of years before, so all the windows are gone. There's no electricity. There was like cold water. The food was awful. It cost $150 a night in cash, in American dollars. But got a knock on my door on Thursday night. It was a Taliban guy, and he said, we're going to be doing an execution tomorrow and an amputation in the Kabul Sports Stadium, and we'd be very honored if you would come. And of course, I jumped at the chance. And the next morning, I found myself in the Kabul Sports Stadium at midfield, watching these kind of very strange-looking Taliban doctors remove a pickpocket's hand. And then and then execute this man. And basically the way it happened was they brought this man out into the middle of the field. He was blindfolded, they sat him down. He had killed some guy, apparently in an irrigation dispute. And the victim's family was allowed to do the honors, and so they kind of handed him a rifle and said, like, do it. And I remember as it happened, they were reading into the Quran, in revenge there is life. Like, in revenge there is life. That's the country that we inherited. That was like a year before 9/11. And so suddenly, like, this is the country that we have to adopt and try to, that's downtown Kabul. That is a street called Jaidi Maiwand, which is like the main shopping district. That was a year before 9/11. That's what it looked like. And people were living in the rubble. It was crazy. It was just a very strange time. But that's the country that kind of fell into our arms. So that's the first, to me, that's the first important thing. The country why did we fail? The country's really hard for all the reasons I just said. It's very foreign, but it was destroyed. It's a very tough place to be. It's a hard part of the world. So the second reason, I think, it's more about us. Folks, we're just not that good at this. You know, we're not as good as we used to be. And what I mean is, you know, we went halfway across the world and we occupied a foreign country and we tried to implant a democracy there, and we really didn't know what we were doing. And it starts with like super basic stuff, you know, like nobody knows the language, you know, and so you're at the embassy and there's like 3 Pashto speakers, you know, and there's 3 Dari speakers, and that's it. And like they want to go home because they've been there for 18 months or whatever, and then suddenly they don't have any. And that's basically what we had there. We just are not that great at this. And if you look at sort of, say, take the British Empire, for better or for worse, in the 19th century they ruled 25% of the Earth's surface. And you know, you read these accounts of the British, these minor officials they'd spend their entire careers in a tiny little district in northwest Pakistan. They knew all the languages. They knew every local leader. They knew all the tribes. They knew the dialects. They were good at what they did. And I think what I discovered was sort of, we aren't good at that. We're just not very good, and maybe that speaks well of us. Maybe it's a good thing that we're not very good at occupying other countries, but we're not. But just to take the language as an example, this is something I saw. This happened all the time. American kids would be set up and they're all kids, a bunch of 19-year-olds would set up a checkpoint, and a bus would come barreling down the road, and they'd yell, "Stop, stop, stop," you know, and it wouldn't stop because they didn't know what they were saying. So they just like, one day I was driving down the road outside the Capitol, and just that, a bus came down the road. They yelled stop 400 times. The bus kept going. They shot the bus up. They killed the whole family. And I talked to a guy, and like, it's like a 19-year-old from Kansas, you know? He doesn't know what he's doing. And so he said, you know, we yelled stop. It's like super basic stuff like that. And so the result is like you have, because the diplomatic corps, and let me just add one more thing about the civilian side of this. As I said, we don't speak the language. We don't get out that much, the United States. Like if you go to any embassy in the world now, any American embassy outside of Europe, or maybe Latin America, it's like a fortress, you know? It's totally militarized. It looks like a building that's being protected against a terrorist attack, because it is. But the result of that is nobody leaves. And so they don't know anything. And these are very smart people, and a lot of them want to go out every day if they could, and they're not allowed. And so, God, to give you an example, like USAID, that's the big arm of the US government that gives money for projects. You know, they gave out billions of dollars in Afghanistan. And so they would give out $1 million for like a new school. And they didn't send anyone out to look at it. So what they did, they told the Afghans, can you just send us photos? Send us photos of like the new school you're building. So, the Afghans were like, sure, and they'd paint, they'd take 6 photos of the same wall, and they'd sell the paint at the bazaar. And I could go on and on, but the problem with all that is that at the end of the day, you have kind of what you're left with is this very militarized kind of approach to dealing with a problem like this. And what is that? What does that mean? It means like, what is the real face of American foreign policy? It's like a 19-year-old from Kansas with a giant gun. He doesn't know anything about where he is. He doesn't speak the language, and he's scared out of his mind. That's it. And so you wonder, like, why is it not working? That's why. We're just not that great at it. The third thing I think, the third reason that I think, big reason that we failed there, and this is maybe not so obvious, is Pakistan. And again, I wish I had a map here. Afghanistan is sort of stuck in the middle of Central Asia and landlocked, and then surrounded by countries that are hostile to the United States, including Iran, countries like that. And so basically the only way we could get our stuff in there was through Pakistan, which is on the Indian Ocean. Pakistan knew this, and so we gave the Pakistanis billions and billions of dollars, billions, like over the course of the war. But at the same time, Pakistanis being very clever, who created the Taliban? Pakistani intelligence service did. And so the Pakistanis were not unreasonable. They wanted to ensure that, this is right on our border. It's always a nightmare there. We don't want 3 million more refugees coming into our country. So we're going to have a player in the game, and the player was the Taliban. And so we're giving them billions of dollars to send our guys up. And the entire Taliban leadership is being sheltered in Pakistan by Pakistani military. We know this, we know all these things. The training camps are there, the suicide bombings, the entire apparatus for the suicide bombings that you read about and heard about in Kabul all take place in Pakistan, and then they're shipped across the border. And there was nothing we could do about it, nothing. We knew where they were, we knew who the people were, we knew where, we knew the house where Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, was staying. Nothing we could do. Why? Because they got us over a barrel. And so that basically, that made the war almost impossible from the get-go, which is basically the Taliban, this kind of guerrilla movement that in 2001 was down to nothing. But they had a sanctuary, and they had support, and they had a whole support network that we couldn't touch. So that's the third thing. So the fourth thing, before I do that, I just want to tell you a quick story to illustrate my point. So I remember, again, everybody knew this. Everybody knew that the Pakistanis were playing this double game, It was completely common knowledge. And it drove everybody nuts. And I remember I was in Pakistan, and I thought, maybe I can illustrate this. Maybe I can actually show this. So I made contact with this Taliban commander who was in Pakistan. His name was Haji Namdar, and he was a very colorful guy. And he said, yeah, come and see me, And he was staying in this area of Pakistan, which is called the tribal areas. And Westerners are not permitted to go. I sort of arranged to go anyway. And it was during this, the Pakistani government was saying, this is the final offensive against the Taliban. We're going to clean out all the training camps and the sanctuaries. This total bullshit. And so I got in the car when the offensive started, and I went out and saw Haji Namdar. And I sat with him, and I said, Mr. Namdar, aren't you worried about, the Pakistani military is out to get you. They're coming after you. And he was like, don't worry about it, I'm fine. And I said, what about the tanks on the roads? What about the artillery? He said, it's all theater. It's theater. So he knew, everybody knew. And that's what was so frustrating about this war, is how much of these things were known and they were in the open. And they were effectively dooming what we were trying to do there, what the United States was trying to do there. So, but I think really the most important thing to me, the most important reason why we failed in Afghanistan was the state that we created, the government that we created in Afghanistan. And essentially what you take this country, Afghanistan, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. You know, the average person doesn't make more than $1 a day. And we basically flooded it with money, you know, to try to kind of make it work. And what did that mean, like in practice? What that meant was that basically the guys at the top, and again, think back, 2001, we didn't have any friends there. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know what we were doing. Who do we reach out for? We reached out for all the warlords. They were the strongest guys in the country. They were the guys that we had given money to fight the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We reached out to them. They're very bad people. They became our allies. And the Afghan state essentially became basically a mechanism to like get that American money that was coming in. And so you're just watching billions of go in, and then it was like a free-for-all. Give you an example. I don't know how many of you have been to Dubai, but it's like the busiest airport in the world. It's a very beautiful place. There's an island off the coast of Dubai's in the United Arab Emirates. There's an island off the coast there called Palm Jumeirah, and it's beautiful. It's amazing. You drive down the streets. There's these gorgeous houses that cost millions of dollars. If you have an Afghan take you, a savvy Afghan, drive down that street, he'll just point out the houses. He'll say, that's the Minister of Culture's house. That's the Prime Minister's brother. That's the Minister of the Interior's house. That's where all the money went. And it's really that simple. That, you know, and again, when I say it was an open view, you know, the American military, God bless them, they have like jargon for everything. Like they have some kind of geeky word for like to describe every piece of reality. What did they call the Afghan government? They called it VICE, and that's VICE. It stood for Vertically Integrated Criminal Enterprise. That's what the American military called it. They knew, like everybody knew, but it was like they were stuck. It was like, what do we do? What do we do if we just blow this thing up? They can't. It's like those are the only friends we have. We have to start over again. We don't know if we're going to have public support to do that. Maybe the money runs out. Maybe we have to go home, then we totally fail. They knew what was happening, and they felt like they were in a straitjacket. And again, it's like one of these, it's like Pakistan. It was like everyone knew what was happening, and nobody could do anything about it. So those to me are sort of the four, those to me are the sort of the four main reasons why we failed. Just to run through them really quickly again. We inherited a devastated country, a totally impoverished country. We're not very good at this. Pakistan was totally screwing us, and we created like a criminal state. That's why we failed, in the main, I think. And I think, but what's, you know, you could hear all that, and you could conclude, you know, we just screwed everything up. We didn't succeed in anything. And you would be wrong. And that's why it's a tragedy. The United States did and accomplished an extraordinary number of things there that had lasting and real value. The easiest one, the most visible one, is women. When I was in Afghanistan before the Taliban came to power, I got arrested by the Taliban. I got thrown out, escorted to the Pakistani border. You're never coming back. Why did I get arrested? Girls were prohibited from going to school completely. No girls went to school. And so I was going to visit, you heard stories about these secret girls' schools that were kind of operated in like people's basements and kind of people's apartments. They were like teaching girls how to read. And there was one in this apartment complex that I was trying to get to. Unfortunately, I didn't make it to the girls' school. I got arrested. They wanted me for something else, but I was on my way to see a girls' school. And so when the United States came in, I mean, the United States educated a generation of women in Afghanistan, millions of women, and it changed everything. And so all the women can read now, not all of them. In some of the rural areas, it's still very, very difficult because it's very conservative, but you now have women who are PhDs, you have women in parliament, you have women running for president, you have one of the vice presidents was a woman. They're all through Afghan society. It's completely transformed the country. It's half the population. Where is that now? And that's why it's such a tragedy. And the other thing that we did there, and I could talk about this for some time, but Afghanistan is like sort of very starkly divided between kind of rural and urban. There's like the cities and there's the countryside. And in the cities, the United States basically created kind of like a functioning, open civil society. And what do I mean by that? I mean like TV stations and newspapers and women's rights organizations and elections. It worked, I mean, Kabul was like a normal, really cool, functioning city for many years. And, it was, the distance between it and the countryside was great, but like, that was real. And if you take the fact that 70% of the population in Afghanistan is under the age of 30, it's a very young country. So most of the young people there like have no memory of the Taliban. They got their smartphone and they're like wearing jeans and they watch TV and they're on the internet, just like us. And what happened to all that? But that was real, and it's like, so I want to get to that part of it. I want to sort of talk about, I just want to talk about kind of what actually happened. The withdrawal itself. And, and I just want to remind you, like, by the time the US decided to pull out and left, we didn't have that many troops there anymore. We were down to like 2,500 troops. It was nothing. It didn't cost anything. Basically, nobody was getting killed because they were basically there to train the Afghan army. And so the cost was pretty low. And so the question became like, what do we do? Like, how long do we sustain this? Is it worth the money? Is it worth the cost? And think about Korea, South Korea. We've had 50,000 American troops there for 70 years. You don't hear about them very much because like nobody's getting killed. And in 1950 when the Korean War started, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. It's now one of the wealthiest. And so it's not an easy answer, this stuff. But that's what we were left with. So basically what happened, if you want to talk about the withdrawal itself, was, I'd say after about 2010, basically we didn't know what to do. It was a quagmire. We were stuck. We can't stay because it ain't working anymore. And we can't leave because if we leave, there's going to be chaos. It's like the definition of a quagmire. We were totally screwed, and we didn't know what to do. And so I think it's fair to say President Obama's solution was just to like kick the can down the road. Like, I don't want to do this. Like, I'm not going to pull us out, but what do I do? He just kind of kicked the can down the road and like, he hoped for the best, And he did that for years. And then, then President Trump comes in, and Trump is like, you remember, like Trump could be like a wild man, but his instincts were essentially to leave. To leave the world. It was like basically, we spend too much money on foreigners, we're too much engaged in the world, let's get the hell out of the world. Screw NATO, screw all that stuff. Trump came in and said, we're leaving, we are leaving. And so they set up these peace talks in, I don't know how many of you know where Qatar is, but it's in the Middle East. Probably some of you have been to the airport there. It looks like Corona del Mar. It's like this very rich kind of, it's a bunch of shopping malls. That's where the peace talks were. And I can't remember when they started, but that's basically where the deal was done. And I remember I went there and like when they were happening, like in 2019, and it was a completely bizarre scene. It was, they were being held at the Ritz-Carlton. And so you had these like you had these like Taliban guys with their turbans and their beards, and they're walking around, and there's like, there's like women in bikinis at the pool. It's a very strange situation. But what was really strange about it was like everybody knew, once again, everybody knew the deal was done. Like everybody knew the US was leaving. And so the important thing was not to say it, right? So it was like the head American diplomat there is this very interesting, very capable guy. His name is Zalmay Khalilzad. He was actually born in Afghanistan himself. He's a very smart and savvy guy. His instructions from Trump were, get us out. What about the Afghans? Fuck the Afghans. And that's a direct quote from President Trump. I don't care. They're not our responsibility. Make a deal and get us out of there. And so that's basically what Khalilzad was handed. And they kind of did the deal. And really, it seemed like the one thing that was required of the Taliban was not to say it out loud, which is like, we won and you lost. It was to say like, we're gonna be really responsible international actors, and we're gonna like continue to have elections and respect women's rights, and you're not losing and we're not winning, everybody wins. And that was what was required of them because like the United States wanted to get out so badly. And so they did the deal right before Trump left, and Trump set a date. And the date was, I think it moved a couple of times, but ultimately the date was August 15th, 2021, just last year. And so Trump loses, Biden comes in. What happens? Biden also was, what about the Afghans? To hell with the Afghans. We're getting out. And so Biden made this kind of show of saying, well, there's already a deal in place, there's nothing I can do, I have to take us out. I mean, he could have done whatever he wanted, but he had decided he'd had enough, and that the US had had enough, had spent enough money, there's too many soldiers dead, we're getting out. And so Biden's instructions were essentially the same. Get us out. And so here's where the story gets kind of really intense, basically, and kind of ends with the scene that you remember, the scenes that you saw on television, the horrible scenes of like Afghans hanging onto airplanes. So when the US went to, I mean, this should be totally obvious, but I think it's not. When the US went to Afghanistan, we basically came in and said, we're gonna build a modern country here. We're gonna build a democracy. We're gonna make it work. We're gonna build an open society. Afghans, we need your help. Join us. We're gonna spend $1 trillion. We're gonna make this thing work. And like, they joined us. They stepped up. And so you had literally tens of thousands of Afghans who had in one way or another risked their lives for us, or thrown their lot in and said, I'm a woman, and like, but goddamn it, I'm gonna be a journalist, and I'm gonna write the truth, and I'm gonna do everything I can to make this thing work. And they kind of, they became our friends on the ground. There were thousands of those people who suddenly, overnight, like when this deal was done, was what's gonna happen to them? Because if the Taliban, if their history is any indicator, really terrible things are gonna happen to them. And we went through the same thing in Vietnam, and we evacuated tens of thousands of Vietnamese out, brought into the United States, 140,000. Left a lot behind. And that's basically what happened here. So in the sort of really crucial months of last summer, you had essentially panic starting to set in, not just among the Afghans, but among people, American diplomats like in the State Department, who were saying, essentially to the White House, we're running out of time. We're running out of time. The August 15th date is coming. You say we're out. What about the Afghans? What about our friends? What about the women? What about all the people that helped us who are going to get killed? What are we going to do? And basically, the White House, I think this is fair to say, did almost nothing. Did very, very little to help them. And the record is very clear in this. They did very little to organize any kind of orderly process. You saw the orderly process on television. They did very, very little. And so that they made some judgments which were wrong, and like you can forgive them for that. But what you can't forgive them for is what I think was a kind of willful neglect of their responsibilities to, say, our Afghan friends on the ground. And so, jumping ahead, this is in August, last August, I was in Lithuania working on a story, and I started to get text messages, dozens of them, from like every Afghan I knew. Translators, government officials, one of the president's bodyguards, people who work for the CIA, like saying, help me, help me, help me. Get me out. Like, I'm gonna be killed. The Taliban put a letter under my door last night. They're coming after me. And like, what do you do? And like, they weren't doing anything on the ground. And so it became this kind of terrible situation. And so I can tell you what my friends and I, my colleagues and I work at the New Yorker, we got together. We'd all been working there for many years, so we knew a lot of Afghans. And we thought, okay, let's just see if we can do this ourselves. So we organized our own evacuations. And like, we were not alone. There were at least half the Afghans who ultimately made it out of the country into the United States to safety were taken out by some kind of private means. People from all over, like Glenn Beck, for God's sakes, like who knew? The CNN guy. He organized like he spent millions of dollars. He got, like, God bless him, he got thousands of Afghans out of the country. I can tell you it was the most harrowing, most stressful thing I ever did in my life. And it was essentially, I can tell you the story of two women. One is Sadiqa and the other is Shikwa. They were both radio journalists in a town called Kunduz in northern Afghanistan. They were totally fearless. They were amazing women. And I knew them in Afghanistan. And they're like, you got to get me out because Taliban's going to kill me, which absolutely they were going to kill them. And like getting them to the airport, and then we raised a ton of money. And there were hundreds of people doing this. Especially former US military, former State Department people who had like personal ties to Afghans. They were like, we're not going to just sit there and let the US government just drop the ball like this in this humiliating, incredibly negligent way. And so I think at one point, I'll tell you the story of the last plane that Shikwa and Sadiqa were on. The last plane we got out, my colleagues and I got out, was in October. It cost $1 million to charter one plane with 300 people on it. We had to bribe the Taliban to get out of the airport to get permission. We paid the owner of this airline $1 million in cash in a bag to get the airplane. The hardest thing that we did, that was all really hard. The hardest thing we did was to get permission from the US government to land. They didn't want to help us. They didn't want to help. And we're talking, like my colleagues and I, we know people at every level of the US government all across, Pentagon, White House, everywhere. All the doors were shut. And we succeeded. But it was extraordinary, the effort that was required to do that. And to me, it was kind of, it was really bittersweet. Like Shikwa and Sadiqa, they're amazing. They're like living in Houston. They're out. Like the last conversation I had with Shikwa, she's very funny, but she was saying, I'm trying to get a Social Security number so I can get a job, I can start working. But they're doing fine, they're great. God, the immigrants who come here, they're like better Americans than we are. But what kills me, really kills me, and what should kill all of you, is like all the people we left behind. And there are so many. There are like tens and tens of thousands of Afghans. And I can just tell you a quick story about one, and I think I'm about out of time. Pretty close. I'm trying to remember her last name. There's a woman named Noor. She's another radio journalist, a woman from northern Afghanistan. And I've been in touch with her for like 3 months, like, can you help me? Taliban are coming after me. They put a letter under my door last night. They're going to kill me. Help me. And I've been to the embassy. I can't do anything. I mean, and the embassy turned into this like kind of bureaucratic nightmare. They were like, well, if you leave the country and come back in, and then you can apply from the third country, and then you come back to Afghanistan, maybe we can help. I mean, it just became preposterous. And I think the reason for that, as I understand it, from pretty good authority, everybody around the President Biden, wanted to help. Everybody wanted to basically get as many Afghans to whom we had a debt out of the country. President Biden didn't care enough, and he has I think it's fair to say he has a pretty well-established record of not caring. It was true in Vietnam when he was a young senator. He didn't give a damn. He's very clear about it at the time. We do not owe these people anything. There's a very well-documented conversation that he had with Richard Holbrooke, no longer with us, former American diplomat. To hell with the Afghans. We owe them nothing. And I think that's what he brought to the White House. And that's why it became so hard. And that's why it became like the nightmare that you saw like on television with like Afghans falling out of airplanes. That's what happened. It all started with the president. He didn't care. And so, you could have people in the White House saying, I'm trying to help you here, like I'm trying to get a green light for your plane, to fly out of Mazar-i-Sharif. That's why it wasn't working. And so it was like really, really frustrating. And I know some of those people. Some of those people are friends of mine, and like when I see them again one day, I'm gonna have words with them. I just don't know what to think about them anymore. It was such a terrible thing to witness. But anyway, I'm getting emotional. But I just want to end by saying, if you remember, we started with Ukraine, and I think what's been so strange to me, but heartening also, is very close to each other. You had these two events, and one was it was America, Afghanistan, trying to get out and just trying to get out away from the world. Enough, we're getting the hell out of there, come what may. To hell with those people, we're leaving. We're the strongest power in the world, and we're a shining city on the hill, and we're a democracy. Done. And just a few months later, when you saw this kind of terrible event, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something clicked. Something sparked the conscience in people's. Well, it got to people, and it exercised people, and people feel completely different about it. And so now you have the United States essentially assuming the role that essentially global leadership that it had for 75 years, which it essentially had given up in Afghanistan. And so it's just fascinating to me that you have this really kind of America at its nadir, its kind of ugly worst, and almost in a way, perhaps unconsciously, trying to redeem itself by coming to the aid of another democracy that's been invaded. So anyway, I've gone on like way too long. And so why don't I just stop talking? And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Obviously, some of my opinions are very strong, so feel free to just fire back at me in any way that you want. But ask me anything, please. And I'm going to lock the doors and not let anyone out if I don't get a question. Thank you. Yeah.
Questions, come to the microphone.
So at its peak, one estimate is that the war was costing $3.5 billion a month. Is that in the ballpark?
Yeah, I think if you didn't hear the question, that the war costs $3.5 billion a month. Yeah, that's probably like a low figure. It's expensive stuff. Yeah. It cost a lot. Good question. Sir.
Where do you see things going forward for Afghanistan? What do the future holds for them?
Well, that's the other part of this, which I don't want to go on forever, but there's a really good story by my former colleague George Packer, who now works at The Atlantic, writing about a group of 6 Afghan women, former soldiers, former police officers, who are being hunted by the Taliban. And the Taliban, as I said when we were standing around the pool at the Ritz-Carlton, they were being very nice. Of course, we're going to respect women's rights. Of course, we're going to keep the schools open. They haven't done any of that. They haven't changed a bit. They've closed the schools. for the girls, and they're literally hunting these women down. Not 6 women, but like anyone they can find. And so, to answer your question, like I don't know, but you know, at some point you would think that they'll want to rejoin the world, and if they do, they'll have to be nicer. If only because the United States, essentially by kind of very complicated international financial mechanisms, is sitting on essentially the entire central bank of Afghanistan, which is basically all the money they have, and we haven't released it yet. And so, if they want that money, they got to be nice, and that's basically the one lever that we have, which is not a small lever. But I think for now, it's the Taliban we know. It's the Taliban we've always known. Sir.
Is your disagreement mostly with the way we pulled out, or do you think that we should have stayed kind of more indefinitely? And if so, then what would the kind of end goal of that be?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Is your disagreement mostly with the way we pulled out, or do you think that we should have stayed more indefinitely? And if so, then what do you think the end goal would be?
Got it. Should we have stayed? Look, I don't know. I'm really glad I wouldn't have to decide whether to stay or whether to go. I do think that whether we should leave is a different question from how we left. The first one is like reasonable people are going to disagree in this room. The second one, it was a disgrace the way we left to me, and I think there's no good answer for it. Man.
Do you think the American public's apparent enthusiasm for helping Ukraine to defend, helping the Ukrainians to defend their country against Putin is a sign that the American foreign policy has turned the corner away from isolationism and towards going back to being the defender of democracy? Or is it just a temporary deviation from going towards isolationism because Ukraine is a white and European country?
Yeah. Well, so basically, have we kind of turned the corner and away from isolationism? Yeah, I think for now. But I mean, that's always been a tension in American history. You know, it's like we have 2 oceans. We're not going to get invaded. Canada's not going to invade us. We can sort of just bail, on the world, and that's always been kind of a big part of America. The part of America that wants to just wash our hands of the world, which you can understand. And that has consequences, which I think we've discovered. But but look, Ukraine, it's horrible. We've all seen it. Is it because it's white and European? I don't know. We stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, for a lot of people that don't look anything like us, for the most part. So I don't know. I think it's the extraordinary brutality with which the invasion was carried out, I think really kind of got to a lot of people. That's my opinion, Sir.
The Afghan army, one of the reasons given for the U.S. withdrawing was the hopes that the Afghan army would serve as a kind of buffer holding off the Taliban and giving central government time to adjust to the transition and something like that.
Yeah.
Was that just for public consumption, or do you think the U.S. military had a pretty accurate assessment that the Afghan army would basically collapse so quickly?
He's asked about the Afghan army, what happened to them. I don't know, it was kind of mixed, but I think, look, I was there right before the collapse, and I spent some time with these Afghan army guys, and they were like, look, they died by the thousands, way more than the American. I mean, we lost 3,500 people there. They lost tens of thousands in the army. By and large, they were really brave, and they fought really hard. I think what happened, to be honest with you, this is my own kind of opinion, but I think when they saw that we were leaving, it was like the air support went away, the logistical support went away, are we going to get paid next week? Where's the food? It was is this worth dying for? I think they just gave up. I mean, I think it was largely psychological, but most armies, fighting and winning or losing is all psychological, you know? And so I think they were just demoralized by the whole thing that was kind of unfolding in front of them, you know? Sir?
Yes, as you have compared with the U.S. with Russia's the war with Ukrainian, I noticed that there is a great difference between them. As currently the Russia is not mobilizing all of its army against Ukraine. You see, the Russia seems to be very patient, and they claim to open so-called humanitarian pathways to allow the citizens to evacuate to the West Ukrainian, as many people believe that this could decrease the level of the hostility of citizens among the East Ukrainian, which can be supportive to if the Russia wants to establish a friendly government in.
I have to stop you because I don't know that much about the Ukraine conflict. I mean, I just don't. Ask me in a couple of months in case I get to go, but not now. I just don't. Except what I read in the papers and see on TV, like everybody else, you know. I wish I could. Sir.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about the involvement in the U.S. Specifically, did we get involved with Afghanistan because of 9/11, or was it to rebuild it? Or was it both? If I recall, you mentioned that the U.S. wanted to rebuild Afghanistan, and I would like to hear some more clarification or your perspective in general.
No, look, I don't think anybody. I mean, you know, in 2001, 90% of the United States didn't know where Afghanistan was. I mean, they couldn't find it on a map. Everybody woke up on September 11th and saw the towers burning. It was like, let's go stomp on somebody. Let's get the people that did this. But I think what happened, again, I think, and this often happens, it's like, well, we'll just go and we'll take down the Taliban because they supported Al-Qaeda, but then suddenly there's no government there, and it's like, well, what do we do? Well, we'll set up another one. And then it just expanded and expanded, and then it became this kind of impossible task. And that's why we couldn't. Look, I can tell you, everybody wanted to get out. Nobody wanted to be there. It's a tough place, and nobody wants to go step on a landmine. Everybody wanted to get out, but they didn't feel like they could, you know.
Okay, thank you.
This is the last one. Might be the last one.
How would the story that you told us tonight be different if the United States had not invaded Iraq in 2003? And what's the relationship between the two wars?
It's a really good question. The question is, would Afghanistan have turned out differently had we not invaded Iraq in 2003? The answer is, maybe. Maybe. Because, literally, you had all the resources, all the attention, everything just went, over to Iraq. You know, and, not just all the resources and all the attention, but, all the special forces units that were there, trying to, hunt down the Al-Qaeda guys. All those guys were gone. You know, all the guys guarding the border in Pakistan, the guys coming over, all gone. And so it just, stripped the place. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Because it's we took our eye off the ball, you know? And then so, God, I remember, in 2001, I mean, I was there in 2001, you know, the Afghans were partying when the U.S. came in. They were throwing their turbans off. They were going nuts. And then, you know, you could drive anywhere you wanted to in the country. Taliban were finished, all gone, all gone. You know, and then you come back 5 years later and it's nobody's watching, you know, and they're back in force. And so, yeah, really good question. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.